Hello, everybody. On January 22nd, Monday this week, there was a Security Council meeting in which Sergey Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, gave a lengthy 16-minute talk on how Russia views the situation in Ukraine. And I will add this his talk, the entire talk, to right when I finish speaking here, so that you can listen to the entire talk, not because I'm a pro-Putin propagandist, but because I really think it is very, very important to understand how one of the main belligerents in this war actually perceives the entire situation, what they officially in front of the United Nations demand in order for ending the war, and how they understand what's happening, and what they want the world to actually, how they want to be seen by the world, right? This is a very important document of current affairs in order to get the Russians, and actually how to maybe negotiate for a peace, because Lavrov clearly says we are still open and we have always been open for peace negotiations. So the West should definitely pick them up on that one. The problem is, of course, well, that the West itself is caught in a huge web of propaganda and its own lies. Now, the interesting thing here is that under the rules of the United Nations, any of the 5 permanent members can always demand for a UN Security Council meeting to take place, and Russia has been using this power to push Ukraine and its solution to the conflict back on the agenda again and again and again. And you can clearly see from the reaction of the US, the UK, and the French ambassadors that they're annoyed that Russia keeps doing this, and that they cannot actually block this from happening. And of course, this is a platform for Russia then to show its version of what is going on. And the West actually says, oh, this is your Russian propaganda, you're just distributing fake news. But no, the Russians just don't let themselves be shut out of the global discussion. And this is actually a way for Russia to push back, for instance, against something like this stupid idea in Switzerland to gather like 80 countries or representatives of 80 countries to have a peace negotiations, a peace conference, without inviting Russia, of course. And the peace formula of Mr. Zelensky, which is basically an unconditional surrender of Russia, that's the peace formula. It's absolutely lunatic to think that Russia would ever agree to something like that, despite the fact that Russia itself was not invited to this conference. And because then the West uses this kind of stupid web platform in order to push its talking points, Russia then pushes back in all the other forums that it can, including the United Nations. So this is something to pay attention to. Now, before we start with listening to Mr. Lavrov in the original, I want to add 7 observations about what he is saying, in order to give a bit of context beforehand, and then Mr. Lavrov comes in the original. I will put a timestamp into this video so you can directly skip to that if you don't want my 7 observations. But here they come. First observation is that Mr. Lavrov speaks about still having no intention of eradicating Ukraine or the Ukrainian people. So this Western talking point of like defending Ukraine, and if Ukraine loses, then the Ukrainian nation itself will disappear. That one, Lavrov says, is utterly is an utter invention. That has never been the idea. And actually, he gives a very interesting example. He says that today, almost 7 million people with a Ukrainian passport are under Russia's protection, either because they did flee there directly, that's about 1 to 1.5 million or something like that, if I've got my numbers straight, or because they're in Crimea or under the Russian controlled territory in the Donbass. So he counts all of these people together and says these people are already under our protection, and we're not eradicating them, we're not killing them, we're not depriving them of their culture or anything. We do the opposite. That one, I think, is a striking argument, because even in the West, there are no large-scale reports of large-scale abuses or anything against the Ukrainian citizens in these Russian territories. On the opposite, the people in Crimea, there are reports that they're being fine and so on. So the Russians are now using this as an argument to say, like, you have you really have nothing to prove that we are going to try to pull off some sort of genocide that you're claiming we would be doing. Second point, the Minsk agreements, he speaks about them again, were a huge sham, and that they were a sham is utterly clear. I mean, we've got this in not only in Russian media. This one here is a Russian media outlet, but that Angela Merkel and François Hollande, who were at the time the Chancellor of Germany and President of France, that they admitted that the Minsk agreements were always meant to buy time for Ukraine, for arming Ukraine. That was a huge disappointment to Mr. Putin. And actually, Putin said so when this came out in December 2022, that he actually believed he had a proper deal with under this Normandy format with the Europeans, that which also included Mr. Poroshenko from Ukraine, right? These four leaders together, they made a deal saying like, okay, this is how we solve the Donbas situation. But that in the end, in 2022, even Merkel admitted that, you know, we always just wanted to buy them time and in order to arm them. This was just such a blatant infringement on basic trust between countries that Merkel and Hollande even said so. You know, that Poroshenko says so is one thing, but Merkel and Hollande also admitted to it, which is a stupid strategy, but it's actually it undermines trust. It's what happened, of course, but even then admitting to it then undermines trust so thoroughly. And the Russians are not getting over this. The Russians in this meeting, in this UN meeting, keep coming back to this, that they've been lied to again and again, even by their European partners, while then at the same time also saying, dear Europeans, and this is my point 3, when are you going to start realizing that the United States is with this attack against Russia through Ukraine, by using Ukraine, also weakening you, which is very true, which is actually also the case. Like the biggest loser of this entire situation is of course Ukraine. The second biggest one are all the people, the Russians who are dying on the battlefield, and then the third are the Europeans whose economies are being ruined because the economic capacity of Europe is now basically shifting to the United States. Lavrov keeps emphasizing this one. Fourth point then is that the proxy war is also a way for the US to in this sense ruin the Europeans. Sorry, I'm just repeating myself. The fifth point he's making is that that the illegal weapons that the United States exports to Ukraine, cluster munitions. You know, there's a treaty on the prohibition of cluster ammunitions, which actually the United States is not part of, Russia is not part of, and Ukraine are not part of. So any of these three states complaining about the other one using or sending these ammunitions is kind of hypocritical by all three of them. But anyhow, there's about 120 or so countries are part of this anti-cluster munition treaty, and this gives rise to like some people saying that this is now part of international law. I mean, this is disputed, but the point is these are horrible weapons. Cluster munition are horrible weapons, and the US supplying them to Ukraine, and Ukraine using them in their own country against the Russian, then like just contaminates a huge area of Ukraine, and that Lavrov says that they're using them even against their own people in the Donbas, which is proof that these people in the Donbas actually need protections from Russia. So you can see how the Russians are very skillful at using these arguments against at using the situation of what the West is doing in order to reinforce their own claim on actually being just there in order to protect the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. And you know, these war crimes and these ways of these horrible weapons, including weapons that use depleted uranium, and the usage of them is of course horrible. And this is exactly what should stop. Luckily, that's the one thing that everybody agrees upon. It's just there's no agreement who has to start with the stopping of the using. Sixth point is that Mr. Lavrov actually speaks about Gonzalo Lira and uses this case in order to argue that the United States really doesn't give a damn about human rights, not even about its own citizens, because that citizen died, was murdered, he says, in Ukraine, and died in a Ukrainian prison, when that could have been resolved by the United States very straightforwardly, very quickly. And he uses that as an argument of saying, like, look, if we gave up our war effort in Ukraine, these kinds of human rights abuses would happen immediately to all the Russian speakers in the East and the US wouldn't give a damn about it. And actually, what's happening in Israel gives him right? Proves him right. So we know that the West doesn't care about human rights when it's at all. It only cares about human rights whenever that suits its agenda, and when it doesn't, then it just closes its eyes and there's nothing that happens. And then like you just forbid anyone from going there and from reporting from there. And then how many ever hundreds of thousands of people die? That's not the concern of the West, right? It's actually a valid point. And then seventh, Russia is still open for peace negotiations, and I think this is the most crucial part because we need to get an end to this goddamn conflict. He says Copenhagen format is senseless, is useless. Of course it is. Russia is never going to unconditionally surrender just because somebody calls something a peace conference. This has never happened unless a belligerent power has been decisively beaten to the point where they couldn't negotiate anymore, where the state had to dissolve, like as what happened in Germany in 1945. Even the Japanese were not defeated to the point where in 1945 they had to accept some form of peace conference. In 45 they accepted unconditional surrender. The peace conference where they then actually signed the peace agreement happened in San Francisco in 1953 after negotiations, after talks were done, which then also included the Japanese, because the Japanese were asked to sign, and a lot of things, then a lot of history developed from there. So not even the Japanese were beaten to the point where such a lunatic peace conference could actually lead to the end of war formally. Now, what Mr. Lavrov is saying is what Russia wants is that the underlying conditions for the weaponizing of Ukraine against Russia are gone. So he also says that the Kiev regime can probably not remain, which, okay, that's a tough one, together with the rest, of course, but okay, that's not a condition. The main condition that he puts in is the underlying conditions need to be gone. And these conditions are, of course, all of the NATO ammunitions and making Ukraine part of NATO in order to use it against Russia. So this has to be struck out, and the Europeans and NATO have to forget about it and to actually commit to not doing it and make it verifiable that they won't do it. And then Russia is willing to end the special military operation, which is a war. They're willing to end the war. Funnily enough, at one point, Mr. Lavrov actually says the warfare that's going on. So even Mr. Lavrov can't avoid the word war completely. So those are my observations. And now please have a listen to Mr. Lavrov's speech in the original. These kind of sources are always valuable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for giving me the floor. Today, we are once again discussing the situation in Ukraine in the context of continued Western weapons supplies into the country, and also in the context of sending Western mercenaries there. We undertook, in the wake of that, measures to eliminate the French mercenaries near Kharkov. We just heard the statement of Mr. Ibo, Deputy to High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. We are grateful for the information and recommendations to Security Council. Today, the absolute majority of unbiased experts see very clearly that the key factor which impedes ways towards a peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis is a continued support on the part of the West to the regime in Kiev. And despite the fact that it is obviously in agony and it is incapable of attaining the goal set to itself, namely to inflict strategic defeat on Russia, or, as is being said recently, to at least weaken my country. The reality is such that despite the complete failure of UAF on the battlefield, the Western patrons of the Kiev regime continue pushing them. They're maniacal in this. They continue pushing them towards continuing with a senseless military confrontation. And this is done under the guise of false words, saying that the crash of the Zelensky regime would be an existential threat for the Ukrainians, and the Russia wants to subjugate them. Those who look deeply into the genesis of the Ukrainian crisis can see very clearly that such statements contain not an iota of truth. Russia began the special military operation in February 2022, and it wasn't against Ukraine, and it wasn't against the Ukrainian people. We are still linked by brotherly ties with them, and it's not a coincidence that after 2014, in Russia, almost 7 million Ukrainians found salvage there. We had to start the military operation against an overzealous criminal regime acting with impunity, who decided, despite many years-long efforts, regime which decided not to reject war against their own citizens in the south and southeast of Ukraine, or to reject the policy of total discrimination of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are still a majority in that country. And the Zelensky regime did this not only in violation of the Minsk agreements approved by the Security Council, but also in violation of elementary principles of civilized society and how it should be functioning, and whilst grossly violating foundational human rights, including the rights of national minorities, which are enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And the Western patrons of the Kiev regime, who were behind the unconstitutional coup in Kiev 10 years ago, throughout this time, not only did not rein in the leaders of the Kiev clique, but also, in addition, on the sly, under the guise of the Minsk agreements, continued arming Ukraine and preparing it for war with Russia. We know this for a fact to date, and this comes from the revelations by the people who participated that directly, who drafted and signed the Minsk agreements, who submitted them to the consideration and approval of this council. The reason why the West conducted itself in such a cynical and criminal way is obvious. Washington and other capitals in the recent times have been stating it openly. And it is that without losing the lives of their own soldiers, the West is fighting Ukraine, fighting Russia using Ukrainians, fighting Russia, which needs to be cut down to size. President Biden even talked about this being a great investment, and other U.S. officials also mentioned this expression about a wonderful investment, and the UK colleagues as well. In the attempt to get Congress to agree to the new aid package for Ukraine, the representatives of the current administration sound even more cynical. We know from what they say, for example, that 90% of the military budget, which is being given by the U.S. to the Kiev regime, remains in the United States as being used to develop the military industry of the country and to update the weaponry. The old, ancient junk is being used in Ukraine. Most of major Ukraine plants and factories, for example, those which are manufacturing lithium, have been sold to the Americans. And the arable lands are under an indefinite lease at very, very low prices. One very good example here is the Soros entity received black topsoil lands for the purpose of burying their Western chemical waste. Mr. Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States, emphasizes that continuing assistance to Ukraine is a guarantee of creating new jobs in the United States. It's as though he's talking not about financing a war, which already resulted in hundreds of thousands of people's lives lost in Ukraine, but about a profitable business venture. The Europeans, and I'm referring to the common sense thinking part of that, the Europeans should wake up and understand that using the Zelensky regime, the United States are not only waging war against Russia, but they're also dealing with the strategic issue of drastically weakening Europe as their economic competitor. Washington undermined its energy independence. It's triggered dangerous crises tendencies in European economy and the social sphere. I'm not dwell too much even on the issue of the act of terror on the Nord Stream. The United States are blocking any attempts to conduct an honest international investigation of that, and current European leaders, in Germany first and foremost, are obediently silent. They have resigned themselves to this kind of public humiliation. At the same time, most of the members of the European Union continue obediently doing what Washington is telling them. When they supply new weapons to Kiev, they're emptying their own arsenals, which will be replenished through buying what is manufactured by the American military-industrial complex. And the Europeans will be forced to find enough money for that. The death merchants are not put off by the fact that their weapons, including cluster munitions and depleted uranium weapons, are being used methodically, mercilessly, and intentionally, knowingly, to strike civilian infrastructure. This was the case during the strikes against residential areas in Belgorod on the 30th December, and yesterday against the markets and shops in Donetsk. The blood of dozens of killed civilians is on the conscience of those who's arming Zelensky, and is saying at the same time that the authorities in Kiev can themselves determine what the goals for their strikes will be. We remember how the Anglo-Saxons, without any military need for that, bombed Dresden in the February 1945. How relatively recently, Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria were razed to the ground. And now they have very worthy successors for their barbaric terrorist methods. The long pumping by weapons of the corrupt Zelensky regime has one more dangerous aspect. The desire to get maximum benefit from the conflict is obvious, because in Kiev the authorities are simply reselling some of Western weapons on the black market. You can find such announcements on the dark net. It's difficult to agree that this is being done without Western merchants, because one hand washes the other. One of the most recent examples is the American M16 rifles, which could be purchased by anyone on the net in exchange for cryptocurrency. And of course, this is a kind of situation that terrorist groups avail themselves of. They get the weapons, these weapons go to Africa, Near East, and Latin America, and this once again brings in additional stability to the regions which are already unstable. This scandalous situation has reached such a scope that it's no longer possible to pass it over in silence. Even the United States has to officially acknowledge this problem. In the recent report issued by Pentagon talks about the diversion of weapons which had been intended for the Ukrainian armed forces, and the amount here is in excess of $1 billion, and I'm sure that is a modest assessment. 40,000 units of weaponry, including drones and grenade throws, have not yet been accounted yet. It is my understanding that the American inspectors went to Kiev to take a look on the ground what the situation is, and I wish you every success. Mr. President, we have heard many times, and we'll probably hear today as well from our Western colleagues, the statement, disingenuous one, according to which that if Russia will stop fighting, the war will end, but if Ukraine will stop fighting, that Ukraine will end. The high echelons of the United States went even so far as to say that Russia would attack Poland, the Baltic states, Finland after that. There's lots of things that you can think up if you want to get money out of Congress and European parliaments when you convince them of the need to continue supporting Ukraine to the detriment of their nationals down to the very last dollar and euro. Asking Russia to stop the special military operation, they understand very well that if this were to happen, that the Kiev regime would lick its wounds and then continue to try and eradicate everything that is Russian, everything that has existed this way for centuries, Russian culture, history, and religious identity, that is. The Zelensky regime would continue pushing something that's foreign for the people, namely rabid nationalism, and glorify those who, together with the Nazis, was destroying during the World War II hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, Russian, Poles, and Ukrainians. The dictatorship would be strengthening, the fight with the opposition would continue in any kind of dissent, and there would be many more political prisoners. And the Western democracies would continue just close their eyes to this spectacle and keep silent, the way they're doing now, even after a U.S. citizen, a journalist, Gonzalo Lira, was tortured to death in the prison of the Ukrainian Security Service. And his crime was that he was publishing objective materials which are critical of Zelensky. Has anyone in the West, especially in the United States, any official has said anything about this death? No. And the Western delegations today and the representative of the Kiev regime will probably not find the courage to comment on this yet another outrageous crime by Zelensky and his clique. Instead of that, we'll hear about Russian aggression and statements that the Kiev regime will be supported. And the lies and the cravenness of its patrons has shown very clearly in the underhanded stage performance in April in Bucha, and our numerous requests to provide us with at least the names of those who supposedly was killed by the Russian service personnel were left without any reaction. I have approached the Secretary General with this several times. There was no reaction. He is simply not allowed to even try and establish what the truth is, because the truth will show up the Western puppeteers. Now, what would happen if Ukraine were to stop fighting? Hundreds of thousands of people who are currently being hunted for in the streets, in bars and churches, and the intention is to throw them as cannon fodder to die to protect the Western geopolitical interests. Their lives would be spared. There are no Ukrainian people's interest in their war against Russia. They never existed. They're only interests of the Anglo-Saxons and their minions and the corrupt and criminal Kiev top leadership, which together with the West cover each other up. They're afraid that they will have to go after the end of the war. They stonewalled the Minsk agreements. They crushed in April 2022 a chance for peace when the United States and UK banned the conclusion of peaceful treaty. They do not want peace today, and Kievan, despite the fact the Kievan regime only survives thanks to Western handouts, and this is something that's being said about the talking heads already. Most people in Ukraine are beginning to understand who their true enemy is and who have been threatening them with Russia through lies and trying to cancel our history. And this change in the consciousness is being seen in the social networks. Despite censorship, a truth will out about people, how people live in Crimea and other territories reunited with Russia. And despite the predictions of the Kiev propagandists, Russia and Ukrainians live together in peace. New authorities are dealing with people's issues and not lining their pockets. And the contrast here is obvious. So that is why in Ukraine and the West, this information is being suppressed. It's dangerous because it shows how Russians and Ukrainians can and should live under conditions where the West is not allowed to interfere into the relationship between brotherly peoples and not to act as an old, as a colonizer and try to pit the two people against each other. And as brothers and good neighbors should, they will live after the end of this special military operation, which will implement its goals, either militarily or peacefully. And we never gave up on the peaceful resolution. We're always ready to negotiate. Negotiate not about how to keep the leadership of the Kiev regime in place, but about overcoming the inheritance of a decade-long destructive looting of the country and violence against the people, on removing the reasons for the tragic Ukrainian situation. Any other peace plans and formulas and platforms which the Kiev regime and its masters keep presenting have nothing to do with peace and are only used as cover to continue war and continue getting money from Western taxpayers. It is unfortunate that the UN Secretariat is risking its reputation when it participates in an absolutely surreal so-called Copenhagen format. All of these formulas are a road to nowhere, and the sooner Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels realize this, the better for Ukraine and the West. The West, for whom the crusade against Russia has already created clear reputational and existential risks. My advice is to heed this and take notice of this before it's too late. I thank you for your attention.